Hey, everybody, and thanks for joining today's stream. My name is Mark Nunnikhoven. I'm a cloud strategist here at Lacework, and this is episode number 2 of Life's a Breach. For those of you that joined us for our first episode, thanks for coming back. For those that haven't had a chance to check it out, you can find it here on our LinkedIn page. We had a great chat about what was coming for cloud security with our Lacework Lab team. In that first episode, really great conversations, some of which those predictions we're already seeing come into play, even though we're only in the second week of January, which, is kind of surreal. I think we're all losing track of time as things move forward here, but we are in the second week of January. Today for this episode, we are going to be tackling Kubernetes, container security, but specifically looking at Kubernetes, how it plays out in the environment, how organizations are adjusting for it, what they need to be aware of, all that type of stuff. And we could not have a better guest on today to discuss this. My guest today is Dave Trader. He's the field CCO at Presidio. He's a longtime security veteran and an actual vet, having served in the Marine Corps. He's seen pretty much everything through his career. It's just an amazingly accomplished resume. I won't go into all the details, but check out Dave on social and all of his other content to get just a glimpse at the amount of knowledge that we're going to tap into today. So Dave, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so this is going to be a really exciting conversation because obviously Kubernetes is everywhere. Everybody installs it, whether they need it or not, and they start rolling on it because there are a lot of great advantages to it. But of course, with that, it is another level of complexity in people's environments, and that can lead to challenges. Anytime we add complexity, we know there's always new security things that we need to talk about. So let's kick it off by commenting on something that I saw recently from Canonical. So Canonical runs the Ubuntu distribution and a whole bunch of other stuff, but they did a really large scale survey around Kubernetes and container adoption. And they were asking some core questions like, why? Why are you doing this? What challenges are you seeing? How are you implementing this in your environment? And one thing that really jumped out at me was one of the results was 64% of the respondents said that the reason they were moving to Kubernetes as a platform was to improve maintenance, monitoring, and automation. So those are obviously key areas, but does that advantage play out? Do you see that happening in the organizations that you work with?
I do. I mean, you need to have that visibility, right? You want to increase that visibility across the board. And really, once you have that visibility, you're able to help with the automation side. And I do see that playing out in most of the organizations that we're seeing. You want to be able to leverage that. You want to be able to have even see the network flow. You need to see how the containers are attaching to the different and various pods. You need to have that visibility as a baseline. And once you have that, then you can have elevated conversations around orchestration and automation.
So it's interesting, and it's great that you're seeing that, but interesting where you can start to have conversations, because one of my next questions was actually around that. Like, everybody's aiming for automation, and we know an environment like Kubernetes, everything's accessible through the control plane, essentially, which gives you that opportunity to actually automate a bunch of the normal operational work to make sure that you're piping that observability data to the right places. Given that you've got a broad set of customers, in different verticals and in different areas, how often are you actually seeing people get beyond that simple monitoring step, either into actual observability or into the automation space, as opposed to just talking about it?
Yeah. So what I see a lot is that we start with the wide open West, right? So everyone goes, they get this capability and they turn it on and it's wide open and they leave it that way. Even as you get down into the containers and you get down into the different pods, you get down into the code, as you're stepping through this, you still are leaving it wide open. And we do that because fundamentally as developers, that's the way we've always we do troubleshooting that way, right? Because we know that it's not an RBAC issue if we have everything wide open. So we develop in that mindset. And I think that's fundamentally wrong, because you need to make sure that you've got role-based access control tailored to what you're specifically working on, and controlling the access into that specific workload is important. And you have to design security from the top down, right, or left to right, however you want to visualize that. You need to make sure that security is baked in. And a lot of times, what we do as developers is we leave it wide open because we don't want that. We don't want that worry. We don't want that to be the case that something's not working. And what I see is we never go back in time, and we never go back and we actually apply the right rules for the right container, the right workload, the right cloud. We don't do that. And so I see a lot of times that that's what stops us from being able to get down into the automation and being able to get it specific to the right work groups. We can do that, but it's wide open when we do. And I see that causing a lot of problems these days.
Yeah. And, I'm chuckling because, it seems like it's a dramatic reveal where it's like live on stream. Dave Trader is making the claim that people don't roll back permissions, right? And I think as security folk, we see that constantly. And I think you nailed the justification is that like, okay, this is probably going to be an issue and permissions gets really complicated really quickly. And so it's easier just to give everybody admin rights, right? Or just leave it all open and don't apply in the first place. But easier is rarely the best way forward, even though it gets the job done. And this kind of ties to a bigger question, because I know in my experience dealing with organizations who are working in Kubernetes, I want to say shocked, but I'm not shocked. I'm more horrified at the amount of developers that have admin access in the cluster, right? And they can do core level admin work in the cluster, and yet there's no guidance around it. There's no anything. What's your experience with access control within the cluster?
Yeah, that same thing. It is we're leaving it way too wide open, right? And you should have, that tiered response. You should also have layers of security on your admins, right? So that privileged access management, you should have break glass detection. No one needs to have it. Separate user accounts is always, best practice, but why even have that turned on, right? When you should turn that off and use like Periscope, right? Break glass. I need to get in there to do this at this level, and I only need it for this designated amount of time. We don't take the proper care and, that comes with treating, that level of access that way. And we need to, because that's what, that's what causes, a lot of these breaches that we're seeing. And that's what causes, the logos to be in the newspaper and on the news and incidents, that we're seeing every day. If we apply fundamental security practices, even into the best technology, the most cutting edge technology, cloud security, if we apply the best in fundamentals that we've learned from coming up through the infrastructure, we can secure these environments. And I don't see us really sticking to the fundamentals, and the basics aren't being done properly. And that's what I'm talking about when it comes to, I see a lot, the admin stays wide open. And if you think about it, I came up through infrastructure, so I'm going to relate back to infrastructure here. When you build the infrastructure and you've got your endpoint, you've got your switches, as you build that from the router on up, when you're layering those things on, you just want to make sure that the flow is correct and you're getting 100% throughput. So you're leaving security off and you're not layering those on. It's the same thing on the dev side, because that's the mentality, is we're just leaving this open to make sure we can get to an endpoint. The issue is we never hit the end, right? We're constantly developing. So you're constantly rolling security to that's the next thing I'll do. And it never gets done. And all of a sudden we're seeing your logo on 6 o'clock news.
Yeah, which is what we all are trying to avoid. But I think, more importantly for security is that we just want resilient systems, right? And part of that, I think it's interesting because as security folks, we tend to take the opposite view of, what you just described as the flow. Instead of starting completely open, you should start closed and open what you need as you go. May take a little while longer because you're manually having to make those or automatically making those adjustments and opening those doors as you go. But you end up with actual least privilege. We're closer to it than everyone's an admin, and we're not sure who made what change at what point. But one of the things you mentioned really kind of triggered something for me was that in a break glass scenario, you introduced that time element. I need this access for this reason for a certain amount of time. And I think that's really interesting because for me, that's where that automation piece comes back in, because we've got the ability to automate the application of permissions now. You can actually add that to least privilege, right? Only the permissions you need to accomplish the task at the right time. And I think that really, changes the game when it comes to access control. But again, really hard to get into the mindset of people. Yeah. Have you seen anybody actually using that time thing effectively?
The U.S. Navy. So yeah, on the DoD side, certainly, it's also known as Periscope, not the app, not the video application, but Periscope or break glass. The idea is just what you said. It's a time block where you have the access open for this long and it expires, and you can actually manage that and automate that. And then you can also be able to review the changes that were made, some even on-screen recording, depending on what privileged access management platform that you go with. But that's what best practice looks like in the most highly secure environments that we've gotten in the world. And it's really good practice, right? Why would I carry around, the credentials in my back pocket to, an environment that could affect millions of users, when I could do it this way? And I think it's important, and it's a fundamental thing, I think it's important that we do that. And not only that, but also, the second key factor, right? Making sure that it's not just a username and password, right? We're layering on security levels so that we're verifying you are who you say you are when you come through to use that ad access. And I know it's tedious, right? The admins out there are going, oh, why I've got to do all this just to get into this environment. Yeah, you do. We need to teach that. We need to teach it that way. Not only do we need to teach it and implement, we need to and automate this. We need to build this into safeguards as things that you can't get around this, right? You can't design your way around this, if your environment meets these certain security requirements.
Yeah, and I think, as security folks, we understand the sort of fundamental requirement, but I think from the dev side and from the admin side, I always prefer to look at it as maybe it's just me, but I'm always paranoid that I'm going to make a mistake, right? I'm going to mistype a command and I'm going to apply it to the entire cluster instead of just a pod, right? Like I'm a human. I'm going to mess up. I've been in this game long enough. I remember the Saturday night change windows, and you're going through your manual list and you're like, oh man, I made a typo on like 2 of 12 steps and I got to go back. And the not having that access on all the time, I find is a nice guard to make sure that I don't make that mistake, because I don't have the admin privileges right now because I don't need them. So even if I did type the command wrong and I applied it to the cluster instead of just what I wanted to locally in a pod, it doesn't work because I don't have that access.
Yeah.
And I think that's a better way to sell it than we're going to make sure that we're applying least privilege and locking it down, because then people just hear things you're taking away.
Yeah. And I think an even better way to position that is with some of the runtime security that we're putting in, which won't allow you to hit, once you hit enter, it's not going to allow you to force something like that would do harm to the environment, and you can automate some of that on that side. I like where the industry is going, with runtime security and how we're evaluating the environment before we're pushing it out to prod. I like that, so that it's a safeguard, right? It's a safety net to make sure that human error we're not eliminating. I don't know that we'll eliminate that, because I think that'll exist always, but we're reducing that. And I think that's important. I rely on that. I like that. So if I'm making a change, I don't want just something to prompt me. I don't, prompt me. Do you want to continue? Because I'm going to always say yes. I've always said yes. I'm going to keep saying yes. I want it to stop me and say, hey, you've architected this incorrectly. This is about to deploy, and this is going to harm the network. We're not doing it. It won't allow me to do it. And so, then it becomes, a malicious decision on my part. Right. And then and of course, developers aren't going to do that. So I think that's the level we need to take it to, instead of, just accepting some of that human error and going back in time. It's a proactive way to put things in front of people to automate that.
Yeah. And I think I really like that idea of sort of in the moment education, right? Like, do you realize what you're about to do? And then take another route to confirm. It was similar to somebody, a couple things tweaked there was that, a few years ago, Google had released a report on the successfulness of security prompts in Chrome. And basically they proved exactly what you just said, is people just click them. Doesn't matter what it says. People will just click, okay, get me to do what I want to do. Which is understandable, is you don't necessarily have the context to understand, what you're actually being prompted. But another thing that came up, because really what you're talking about is adding some friction in to protect against bad changes. Somebody online a couple of weeks ago had commented they didn't realize the context of it necessarily. And they said, it's super frustrating that with AWS specifically, if you're in the web browser and trying to delete something, the process to delete something is different for every single service. And so sometimes you need to type delete to confirm. Sometimes you need to type the name of the object. Other times you need to type confirm. And it was pointed out by one of the UX designers that that's actually on purpose, because then that way you don't build a habit of just automatically retyping delete or automatically just clicking OK. You actually have to read what it's asking you to do in order to confirm an action that could potentially be really bad. And I think as frustrating as that could be, that's a really good pattern to make sure like, hey, you're about to wipe out this whole cluster. Is that actually what you wanted to do? Because odds are it's not.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's part of the, hitting those accept buttons has sometimes become part of our, our authorization process and our mindset. And we've all been there. It's 3 o'clock in the morning and we're running on 6 Red Bulls. It's, you want to make sure that there's not just a prompt, but a 2x4 that smacks you upside the head and says, well, you're about to do something dangerous here. Do you really want to do this? And that moment of pause. And when you get to that point, it's important to take an inflection point right there and say, okay, hold on, time out. Let me go back and see what I actually did here. Because we've all been there. We all get it. But I think it's important because this is how leaky S3 buckets happen. This is how things walk out the door inadvertently, and that causes some serious problems.
Yeah. And so jumping back a little bit and getting back on focus on the Kubernetes here. You mentioned, you're an infrastructure guy and working as that as an analogy, or at least that's, early in your career, that's where you're focused. Me too. The Kubernetes project has a really good way, I find, of sort of explaining the layers of security for defense in depth. And they call it the 4 C's. So they go cloud, cluster, container, and then code. Is that a process that you've sort of just intuitively apply when you're looking at Kubernetes? And does that line up? Do you think, is there any weaknesses there? What are your thoughts?
I think compartmentalization is an excellent strategy when it comes to the 4 C's. And when you're starting with, you hear the shift left, I have a little bit of trepidation around the shift left. I don't know that I want to make sure that we're not just in one spot. We need to be ingrained in the fabric throughout the project, throughout everything that we're developing, throughout the entire life cycle in SDLC. But I think it's important on the compartmentalization side, right? That's what we're doing. We're starting at the cloud and we're working our way down to the code. And I really think that that's where you're going to see the future of security, go, and we're seeing that with, supply chain and really getting down and being able to assess the code. There's a lot of bad code out there that needs to be updated and rewritten. And we need to apply some basic security principles on that side. But I do think it's important. Those taxonomies help you understand what level you're at and what level you're making changes. And also you can apply role-based access control based on the same model. So I like it from that perspective, and I like how they've come up with that and architected that.
Yeah, and it seems like it's an easy sort of, when you're crossing those layers, it's a place to apply security controls. So that's the whole admission controller idea, right? You're being admitted from one layer to the next. But also it's that, like you said, the logical point of, okay, if you're making changes here, should you be making changes here? What is the set of permissions? Who should be working at this level? And it kind of goes back to your earlier comment where devs should be focusing on that code layer and not worrying so much about the others, because the others are already guiding them towards the right decisions. But do you see that, anywhere in particular where companies or teams are making mistakes or getting tripped up with this kind of approach?
Yeah, so I think the toughest one of those is going to be really around the code, and this is why it's a static analysis still at the code level in some cases. Now there are platforms out there that are dynamic. There are platforms out there that are a little bit even big brother. So there's a threshold. If you're a developer and you're working on something and you go to initialize that code and you've left something open, maybe you've made a mistake in the code, or you've actually dropped something malicious or inadvertently built a backdoor. Those things get logged, right? And a lot of times, there's the capability to kick those off. If you do it 10 times, out of 100,000, this is probably on accident. But if your threshold continues, that's letting the security team know. And I've been part of organizations where the security team is right there, not physically, but they're able to see, how many different, pieces of bad code you're putting in. I think that's where the industry and enterprise needs to catch up a little bit, is on the code piece in and of itself, because I think that there's just a lot that we don't do on the quality assurance side to check that code before it's exported. And there is a lot of it's clunky, it's leaky, and it can be firmed up. And I think that's where we can focus a little bit more. So organizations aren't really doing software assurance on that front. So we're depending on the developers to do it correctly. And sometimes that gate check is at the end of the SDLC. And that's not the way we want to do it anymore. Static analysis, we shouldn't be doing that. We should be doing full dynamic analysis as the code's written, as you're initializing, and goes back to kind of that runtime, security mentality, making sure that when you initialize that code, okay, this is solid, it's good, it's clean, let's go, let's move on to the next step. And it's a CI/CD constantly. We're constantly looking for that feedback loop, and I think that will give us solid security. We got to get away from that static analysis, the gate check mentality. We got to move away from that. It's just what we were doing in the 90s. We shouldn't be doing it today.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I think the interesting thing is a platform like Kubernetes enables that to be so much easier because of the way, you're not worrying about capacity management, right? If you're trying to figure out how your application is interacting across multiple pods, you can just spin them up and make sure that they're in an isolated area or in a completely separate cluster, and be assured that what you're testing is the same thing that's going to end up in production. Because that was where all this stuff used to fall down, right? Is that you had your completely distinct environments of prod, of dev, and of test, and they were never synced up. They were never a realistic replica of each other. So, you'd always get the devs going, well, it worked in dev and it worked on my machine. And, that was the whole impetus for moving to containers, is to sort of simplify that. But we haven't updated. Again, it comes back to, we're not updating our mental models of saying this old approach doesn't work anymore. We need to get into this more modern area. And I think it's a big challenge, obviously, for people to get there. But there's definitely a lot of new tooling. There's a lot of new, great open source projects out there that'll help with this kind of stuff. But the good news is it's possible. Whereas 5 years ago, I'd be like, yeah, you're crazy. It's great. I would want that too, Dave, but I also want a unicorn.
Yeah, exactly. I actually, how far we've come in a short period of time is very impressive. The way that we're able to automate this today, the advances that we've had, even on the ability for, you can call it, quality assurance, but even on the actual secure coding side of the house, that we've come leaps and bounds, and leaps and bounds. And I really am looking forward to what we're going to do next around even the open source side of the house, being able to go through and say, yeah, this is open source, but what are we going to do to assess the security around this? Because we know we're all doing the same thing. We're pulling from, various sources. I won't name the sources. We're pulling from various sources and copy and pasting, because why reinvent the wheel? We need to make sure what we just grabbed down from that, from that bucket is okay, to drop into whatever source code we're putting together. I don't think we're doing that step. We're skipping that step, and we're just trusting that blindly. And that's always a bad move.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because I will mention a source just because it's relevant. Was Stack Overflow had a really great blog recently where originally they had the April Fool's joke of the Stack Overflow keyboard, which is just Command C and V for copying and pasting. And, that was a joke, and then they actually made it a real thing. But they conducted a survey to see how often, and looked at their data to see how often people were just straight copy pasting from all the answers on Stack Overflow. And it was insane how high it was. And it's not unexpected, but to see the data in hard numbers, it was high 80% of developers were just copy pasting. Which I get it. I'm writing code. I want to solve a problem. I did it literally just yesterday, trying to solve a problem for a script that I was using for a research project. I'm like, yeah, just copy and paste it in. Do I fully understand that code? No. And that's a bad thing, because, for my research project, no big deal. It's isolated. It's a limited risk. But if I'm running in prod, what if I just opened my company up to, right? Yeah. And that's just how we're doing things. Right. And it's, we need that rigor and that culture change. Yeah. But we also need to balance it with getting stuff done.
Correct. And that's the other side of that pendulum swing, right? Is we're in the middle of me, I'm in the thick of it. I need to get this out. I need to make sure that this works. I'm not going to take the time to do a full, source code evaluation and secure code model and scrub this to see if there's any. I'm not going to do that. I need to move on this. We've all done it. I'm just saying we should actually have something that before we can put that and promote it to prod, that it gets scanned and someone says, yeah, this is valid or this is certified and it came from a good source. We're not there yet, but I think that's where we'll get there. And definitely, I think we'll be there 5-10 years, 5-10 more years. You're going to see a lot that we're doing on open source because of how badly we're seeing, hits come in from the supply chain.
Yeah. And I think we're starting to see that take root with container image scanning, at least. Where, the early days of containers, people were literally just pulling the layers down from Docker Hub and deploying them out without checking. And now at least people are realizing, like, no, I need to stage them locally in a registry. I need to scan things before we get out there just to make sure, because we've seen that rash. Thankfully, nothing crazy malicious, but a lot of crypto miners pre-embedded and stuff, and just wonky code, right? Because that's an issue as well. and this kind of ties to something that you mentioned. I'm curious to get your opinion on it. So early day Kubernetes is somewhat stabilized the last 12 months, which has been nice, because it used to be, you'd wake up on Monday and you're like, oh, they've changed how networking works. Okay, like let's reevaluate this.
Yeah.
But in the last few months, we've seen the move away from policy-based security controls into the admission controller idea, which is basically just applied policies at a moment in time as opposed to generalized. Do you see that innovation, like the ability to actually respond, is that causing problems for teams who are up to speed and like locked in on the old model? Or is that a benefit of the fact that they recognized there was a better way to do it and moved the whole ecosystem towards that?
Yeah, the latter. I think that it does help, because if you've got an advanced team like that and they're open to the new ideas and they're open to the new way of being able to do this, they're receptive to the changes, right? And those and being able, the admins understand that the point in time policies and being able to get it's actually getting granular on what you need to do, and it solves for X, because X is, you're solving for a specific problem without really impacting the rest of the environment, and they appreciate that. I think the most advanced dev teams out there, they appreciate that and they're embracing it. So I look forward to that. I think there'll be more of that. Unfortunately, I don't see a lot of advanced in-house teams that are ready to go, like on the bleeding edge, if you will, of accepting some of this. That's more, it's a little rare in my line to see that advanced a series or a team that has that type of capabilities.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to the next question, because Kubernetes is a big piece of infrastructure, right? And I've seen a lot of teams who aren't at that scale yet implement it early, and sometimes it's optimistic, other times it's just, oh, we thought we needed this because we have containers. But it leads to this question of sort of, is the best way to go for most people a managed service, so from going from one of the big CSPs, or should they be rolling their own if they've got an infrastructure team? Like that seems to be a challenging decision. What have you seen in your experience around?
Well, I think this is just my opinion, because I think that everybody's a snowflake, and some every environment has got to be a little bit different. But when you assess it, from my perspective, I think you've really got to go down the path of ensuring that you've got everything set up correctly there. For me, I don't know what side we're going to end up going on. But sorry there, I just had something jump on the screen here.
No worries.
Can you go back? Can you give me that question one more time?
Yeah, it's basically the difference, Kubernetes being a big chunk of infrastructure itself is managed, like getting a CSP to manage it, or managing it yourself.
I know where I was going. Sorry about that distraction.
Yeah, it's all good.
So, it kind of goes back to how security teams are set up today. I think that you're gonna want to have a roll your own in your own environment. You're gonna have somebody that's responsible in your environment that knows what they're doing, but you're gonna have a 1-to-many ratio, meaning you need to have that managed security service in the back end. You need to have somebody that's wakes up every morning and thinks about the code for your environment, but then you also need to be able to leverage that 1-to-many ratio to that army behind them of people that are able to scale, because I don't think that organizations are able to scale themselves. Meaning you can't hire that's a massive hire, right? You're keeping that talent in-house. While it would be nice to have, it becomes a little bit prohibitive on the financial side. So what you want to do is that 1-to-many ratio, and I see a lot of organizations leveraging managed services on that front.
Yeah, and I think that's sound advice. And the challenge is always figuring out where that line of management exists. Because with something like an Office 365 or Google Workspaces, it's pretty clear, like, okay, we can just use this, we can manage our users and set some permissions, and they handle the rest. Yeah. With Kubernetes, it's really this platform. And so, there's a lot of wavy lines as to who does what where. So it's always worth, if you're going that route, to make sure that you know where that line is for each specific area and can configure, that to your liking, because everyone's got a different risk tolerance as well.
Yeah, for sure. And exactly, the risk tolerance and how you come up with that risk management is also key, and how, in what avenues you choose to be able to handle that for you. I know on the cybersecurity side, that's exactly how, we're doing it in most cases. Even to get to those SOAR conversations, you've got a small in-house team, and they know what needs to be done. It's just they don't have as many, of the hands, the eyes. They don't, and what they're able to do is they're leveraging managed services to scale that. And it's important because you get that piece, and you kind of promote your team at the same time, where they're valuable because what managed services is finding throughout the day or the evening or whatever, they're rolling that up to the team, and your team, internal team, becomes even more vital.
Yeah, and so it's using that managed service to up level the work you're doing, right? Which is good, because none of us ever want to do that grunt work if we don't have to, right? And then that's why good tooling, good services in play. So let me ask you this question. It was supposed to be sort of aspirational, but I think it's going to be far more pragmatic given the challenges that people are facing with Kubernetes in their environments. If you could only tackle one thing, and this is where it was supposed to be sort of that hypothetical of like, oh no, we can tackle everything. But I think the reality is people can really only tackle one thing at a time. But if you could tackle one thing, or tell people to tackle one thing in their Kubernetes environments, what would you go for? Would it be something like crazy niche, or like foundational basic principle kind of thing? What would be your advice?
I would go fundamentals and basics all day, because and here's why: 9 out of 10 environments that I get called into for incident response, and to step through, maybe putting something back that got loose on them, is because something fundamentally went wrong. And it's not because it's the most niche, most advanced thing that we could come up with. I would focus in on identity access management, role-based access control, making sure that you've got, permissions set for who should have access to what environments, and make sure you're rock solid on that, and really make sure the fundamentals are sound. And then go back and check it again. And that's, I continuously, encourage organizations to take a look at the fundamentals, start there, and make sure, and go back and recheck it. Because, again, and that applies in a Kubernetes environment as well, because we've got to make sure that the fundamentals are sound, make sure all the doors and windows are locked properly, and make sure only certain people have the right keys. That's a fundamental. And I see that, that so many different places, they want to talk about the newest and the shiny object. I can't have those conversations if the fundamentals, and we don't have that fundamental platform set and ready to go. If it's not, cemented and solid, I can't go up to the levels over where we're talking about orchestration and further automation, because we don't have the basics covered. So it's cyclical in that sense. And I think that's why, if I had to pick, I would do something around the fundamentals. I love the advanced conversations too. I love talking about the latest and greatest and the best thing. I love the advanced and automated conversations, but I can't have them if we're not doing the basics right.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fair. So let me throw you a bit of a curveball, but I think it should be okay. But if it's not, just tell me, and when we'll close things out, it's all good. But given your experience, and given the amount of conversations you have with the wide variety of people at a high level, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you for a piece of advice. So if you could give one piece of advice to people about having a cybersecurity conversation with the business, what would one key thing to be? Because this is your bread and butter, and you've done it for decades, and you're one of the best at it. How would you suggest, what do you think is the biggest blocker to having a productive cybersecurity conversation with the rest of the business?
Oh, undoubtedly for me, it's we're technical people, right? You and I are both technical people. The business understands different things conceptually. You have to be able to speak business. You have to be able to translate geek, that's me and you. This is what we've done our entire life. You have to be able to translate this into business speak, and actually speak to it's not just how you phrase it. It's actually identifying business outcomes, because that's what the CEO is interested in. That's what the CIO is interested in. That's what the CISO should be interested in, is the business outcomes. What are we trying to achieve? And work your way backwards. If you don't have an understanding of what the business is trying to achieve, but you have a tremendous, understanding of how the technology works, you're going to still have that lost in translation moment where you cannot get your point across, and there's that barrier of communication. It's really important to make sure that you've got someone that can translate those two things. And because we have a tendency to go right at the technical problem and say, I'm solving this technical issue, I'm going to provide this type of capability, it's going to be awesome. And then that doesn't speak to the business outcome that the CIO is going to meet, or the board is interested in. So I would really say, the key thing is to figure out that translation and have a balance between, the dev side, and then being able to speak to the corporate environment and just know what those business outcomes look like.
Yeah, that is fantastic advice, because I mean, you need to look no further than the mountain of acronyms we love in security to understand the depth of that problem. Because even within security, we can't keep them straight. So how, using our language, would we communicate with anybody outside of our little tribe, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic advice, Dave. I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. I learned a ton, so I know our audience did as well. Very, very, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for joining us on stream today. For the folks who are interested, they can follow you here on LinkedIn. And are you active on other platforms as well?
I am. I'm on Twitter as well.
Okay, perfect. So we'll make sure to share your handle in the comments, because you can get more great insights like this from Dave and follow his great work. So thank you again. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining the stream. We're going to be doing these pretty consistently. So remember to follow the Lacework page here on LinkedIn, as well as follow our blog, lacework.com/blog. We've got a ton of great research that we post there, as well as looking at challenges like Kubernetes environments, like the modernizing security, issues like that. It's a really great set of resources. So again, lacework.com/blog, and we'll see you in the next episode.